Hello, everyone. I can see people are joining. We're just going to give about 1 more minute as people are still joining the webinar before we start. Great. Yeah, Vicidius. Okay, great. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Ann Rennick. I'm the Deputy Director for Research at the Arab Reform Initiative. Today's webinar is the second in our series titled The Politics of Transition in Syria and Comparative Perspective. So this series of webinars, which we are going to be hosting we had for a previous one already, we have several more coming, emerged because we wanted to foster a dialogue to exchange research expertise and scholarship expertise on different political transitions in light of the political transition occurring at the moment in Syria. We started from the premise that there are a variety of different issues and challenges that arise in the context of political transition. This concludes everything from institutional design, issues related to justice and the pursuit of justice, reconstruction and reconciliation, governance models, as well as broader issues related to the form of the state, the form that the state will take. And that these issues and challenges are both urgent, they're concurrent priorities, but they're also deeply contested and actually can come into conflict with one another. So our aim with this series of webinars is really to center Syrian scholarly expertise and to put it in dialogue with comparative cases and experiences. So our goal here in these discussions that we're hosting is not so much to offer policy solutions or recommendations. It's really rather to situate Syria within the broader global conversation, to kind of look at and explore what comparative scholarship insights can inform about the Syrian case, but also importantly, what the Syrian case can teach us about the politics of transition. So this series of webinars is being co-convened by the Arab Reform Initiative, ARI, and the Arab Political Science Network, APSN. I'm going to go ahead right now before I forget and announce that the third webinar is currently scheduled. It will take place on July 17th. So we will be communicating more about that shortly, but I wanted to put that on everyone's calendar already. Before we begin, just a few quick reminders. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be made available online probably within 24 hours. We're offering interpretation in Arabic. You can go down to the Zoom toolbar and select your preferred language. And we will have a series of presentations by our wonderful speakers today. And you can type in your questions using also the Q&A in the toolbar, and then those will be fed to the speakers during the Q&A session afterward. Just briefly about the two organizations. So the Arab Reform Initiative, we're an activist think tank. We carry out research on a variety of different policy issues and policy areas covering the various countries of the Arab region. And we also support and try to really foster grounded local research on issues related to democratic change, accountability, and various forms of inclusion and social justice. APSN, for its part, is a professional network that is dedicated to supporting and connecting political scientists from across the Arab region, both inside and outside the region, and to create an inclusive, accessible space for critical and policy relevant scholarship. You can find links to both organizations in the chat. And then finally, today's webinar is titled Political Institutions and Sectarianism in Syria's Transition. And we're going to be focusing today on the question of various types of political institutions, whether these are electoral systems, whether these are power sharing arrangements, or indeed even decentralization models, and how these intersect with questions related not just to sectarianism, but also to issues of inclusion and representation in Syria's transition. The webinar today will be moderated by Dr. Mohammed Mustafa Al-Absi. He holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Grenoble Alpes in France and is a former fellow at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. And he is currently designing a digital project to gather and disseminate academic knowledge about the Syrian conflict in Arabic. So I will go ahead and pass the floor to him, and he will lead you through today's discussion and introduce the four speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, the audience. I thank you for your presence and for your attention. So today's, as Sarah said, is Politics of Transition, Syria and Comparative Perspective. We are at the second session, Political Institutions and Sectarianism in Syria's Transition. I want to welcome our guests and outstanding speakers. Stephen Heidemann, political scientist, specializes in the comparative politics and political economy. Basilio Zeno, Assistant Professor of Political Studies at the Trent University, and Shamira Malko, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations and Political Science, and Salam Al-Sadi, who is PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Of course, I will present them with more details because now I'm going to give some background of our today topic. So I will present each of them with more detail before each speech. So now I'm going to give some background to our topics about sectarianism and institutions. We all know that we are at 7 months after the fall of Bashar al-Assad regime. So I will mention a number of events, a number of dates, and a number of events that happened related to the institutional transition. Maybe we'll have some adjustment, we'll modify or we'll precise as we are moving on during the conversation. But I'll give myself like 3 to 4 minutes before giving the floor to our speakers. So as a reminder, Assad regime fell on the 8th of December of 2024 after 10 days of military campaign by HTS, by a coalition led by HTS. Then in December, HTS and its allies declared the establishment of a transitional government. And then on the 29th of January, the Victory Conference, which called the Victory Conference, the military factions appointed HTS leader Ahmed al-Shara as interim president and set out plans for national dialogue. This national dialogue was set in February as the government held the national dialogue and received a lot of criticism because it lasted only 2 days. They invited hundreds of people, and then it didn't give any, it gave like only formal declarations without any engagement of political movements or serious engagement of activists. And sometimes they gave only like 2 days before the invitation was sent to people, and people who were in Europe, who were in the United States and outside of Syria. Then we go to the sectarian problem when on the 6th of March, military ambushes on the coastal region in Syria were set by former regime members, which led to wide attacks and series of extrajudicial killings and massacres. The number of victims was between 1,000 and 2,000 persons. We still don't know a lot of details about the precise number of victims because number of people left to Lebanon, some of them left to military bases in Russia, and so on. So we are still waiting the results of the Committee of Investigations. On the 13th of March, al-Shara signed the Constitutional Declaration, which officially marked the start of a minimum 5-year transitional period. This Constitutional Declaration consolidated all executive powers of the state during the transitional phase in the hands of the president. The interim president, as critiques or websites or reports analyzed, concentrated the powers into the hands of the president, as he's the person or the authority who chooses the members of the government, the members of the National Security Council, and the judges of the Supreme Constitutional Court. He also, the president of the interim president, nominated the third of the future People's Assembly as we are see during our conversation. At the end of April, and this is another sectarian event, at the beginning of May, we saw clashes of sectarian nature, and this time between Druze and Sunnis. The background of these clashes was the problem of stretching the new government control over Druze majority areas, something that the most eminent Druze leaders, and especially Sheikh Muhammad al-Hajari, still refused to accept. In the media, we had the information or the argument about these sectarian clashes. They were because of a video tape where the Prophet Muhammad was insulted. But we will see also, we will check with or analyze with our guests about the real or the microspace, maybe reasons of those clashes, as a lot of problems between maybe the city of Deir ez-Zor and people of Sueda in the past, and the impact of the conflict history on the current situation. And lastly, a couple of days ago, on the 17th of June, a presidential decree appointed a Supreme Electoral Committee for People's Assembly election, which is Majlis al-Sha'b, and this body is tasked with field visits to governorates, setting timelines, and they gave themselves 2 months to finish their job, and then overseeing the selection of 2/3 of the assembly by local election committees, which means that local committees will choose 100 representatives, and then the president will appoint 50 members of the transitional parliament. So we will talk about all of these points and others as we are moving on. And now I will give the floor to Steven Heidemann, but before this, I will present him with more detail and about his work during the last few years, and about Syria in particular. So Steven Heidemann is a political scientist who specializes in the comparative politics and the political economy of the Middle East. He holds the Janet Wright Ketchum Chair in Middle East Studies at Smith College. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy and the Brookings Institution. Among his many publications are Syrian Regime Resilience and State Power Through Contracting Stateness, The Cases of Al-Hasaka and Aleppo, with Reynold Linders. Another publication, Rethinking Social Contracts in the MENA Region, Economic Governance, Contingent Citizenship, and State-Society Relations After the Arab Spring, 2020. The Syrian Conflict, Proxy War, Pyrrhic Victory, and Power Sharing Agreements, Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, 2020. And No Exit, Conflict Economic Governance and Post-Conflict Reconstruction in Fierce States, in Luigi Narbonne, edited Fractured Stability, War Economies, and Reconstruction in the MENA, 2019. So I give the floor to Steven now. We'll listen to him, and then we go back to the next speaker. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm grateful to ARI and to the Arab Political Science Network for giving me the chance to participate. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to hearing from my friends and colleagues on the panel, and from learning from what they have to say. That was a fabulous introduction to what I think the panel will cover this morning. And on my part, I thought it would be most helpful to focus perhaps a little bit less on the events of the past 6 months, and I think you summarized many of the high points very well, and more on what lies ahead. And I decided that this might be an appropriate approach because, in my view, this panel comes at what is really potentially a very important inflection point in Syria's transition, and it's one you referenced, and an important inflection point as well in the process of institutionalizing Syria's transition to some kind of post-Assad political order. And that means that I think, at least, it's also an important inflection point in defining the role that sectarianism is going to play in shaping a future Syrian state, and in particular, the extent to which Islamist worldviews of various kinds will play a role in shaping the future of the Syrian state. And when I refer to inflection points, I'm kind of reinforcing the attention that you gave to this announcement just a few days ago on June 13th, when we learned about the formation of the Supreme Committee for People's Assembly elections. And as you pointed out, this is the body to oversee the indirect election of a new People's Assembly, which is going to happen pretty quickly. It's going to involve some popular consultation, which is very important, but it is a process that's expected to be complete really by very early fall, very late summer. And just to put that process in a comparative context really quickly, this moment in which the initial legislative body is formed, is really a critical point in virtually every transition from autocracy to something else that we have seen. It was a critical moment in Tunisia. It was a moment in which the Tunisian transition became bogged down for many years. It was a critical transition in phase in the transition in Egypt, which was cut short by the coup of El-Sisi in mid 2013. So this period now, when this committee has been formed, it's begun its work, and the assembly will follow, and the assembly will then take up its work, is a really crucial one. And as a result, and not surprisingly, this whole process of shaping the assembly and then determining how it's going to do its work, what its agenda will be, what its priorities should be, have really become focal points for competing visions about what kind of state Syria will be in the future. And these big questions, and you can get some sense of just how meaningful this moment is, include what will the role of Islam be in a future Syrian state? What the position of minorities will be in a future Syrian state, including the Kurdish minority, the Druze minority, the Alawi minority, and to a somewhat lesser extent, the Christian minority. There are huge debates happening in Syria right now. I was there in late May, fortunately, and some of this had already begun, about whether a future Syrian state, whether the General Assembly will contribute to the development of a state that carries at least some of the attributes of a civil state, which is what Syria's civil society would like to see, or whether the assembly is going to further consolidate the kind of state order, the kind of political order that has taken shape in something of an ad hoc fashion since December 8. And if I had to try to characterize that post December 8 political order very quickly, I'd say, as again, as we heard in that wonderful introduction, it's been organized in a heavily top-down fashion. It's somewhat exclusionary. It's basically personalistic. It's clientelistic. It's moderately Islamist. What we've seen, I think, is a trend toward a more or less soft form of Islamist authoritarianism that, when I listen to Syrian colleagues, is understood as an improvement on the regime that fell on December 8th. I don't think that's in question, but it's also seen as very far removed and maybe not even interested in anything resembling a kind of pluralist, fully inclusive, accountable form of government, much less any kind of democracy. Democracy is not a popular word with the leaders of the interim government. And my sense is that the direction that Syria is going to follow is going to become increasingly clear. First, as the nominating committee identifies who it sees as the candidates for this indirect election, and then who are the 50 that President El-Shara is going to appoint. That's one critical threshold for understanding the future direction of institutionalization and sectarianism. The second is what happens once the assembly begins to take up its role. It has enormous responsibility, revising the Constitution, drafting basic legislation like a political parties law that will determine the architecture of a future Syrian government. And this is the kind of crucial moment in which we will see Syria's transition shift to a phase of institutionalization. And there is some potential, I think, to move Syria beyond this current period in which authority has been really almost effectively monopolized by the person of the president, who's benefited from what Syrians themselves describe as the revolutionary legitimacy that he secured as a result of overseeing the coalition that overthrew Bashar al-Assad. And we could see the assembly begin to consolidate a new phase in the transition where authority may potentially be anchored more deeply in institutions and in the rule of law, and where we see a shift from revolutionary legitimacy to performance-based legitimacy, where how well the government is doing in meeting basic needs on a huge range of issues is going to be the metric that determines both how Syrians view the government and how successful the transition is going to become. So, how likely are we to see this kind of shift from personal rule to institutionalized governance, from moderate to more fully inclusive forms of governance? I think there are some real challenges, and I'm just going to take another minute and summarize these and then wrap up, because I really want to get to hear what everyone else has to say. We've all seen, and they were referenced in the introduction, the tensions and frictions and the kind of sectarian push and pull that have been evident in how al-Shara has governed since December 8th. We've seen how he's tried to juggle all these competing interests that include the jihadist elements of his base, the Sunni majority that has something of a sense of entitlement to rule after decades of oppression, this notion of it's our turn now. He's been trying to juggle the concerns of minority communities that are fearful of their vulnerability, and the violence that we've seen since December 8th gives them a legitimate basis for that sense of fear and vulnerability. And then there are the external actors who are trying to pull al-Shara in very different directions about governance and the state and institutions and sectarianism. We've also seen how, al-Shara himself, in his determination to kind of remake himself as a pragmatic political moderate who's no longer, he may still be a Salafist, but he's no longer the jihadist that he was in the past, and how this process of reshaping his identity has been tested by his overtures to his Islamist base, including this recent decree banning the sale of alcohol in restaurants without a license, the recent decree demanding that women cover themselves if they're going to go to the beach, and things like this. We know, and it was referenced earlier, that he has this very rigid preference for this really strongly centralized, very personalized system with a strong and empowered presidency. And frankly, that mirrors some of the less desirable attributes of the old regime. And I think as the People's Assembly is formed, as it does its work, we'll gain a lot of visibility into which of these visions of a Syrian future is going to be one that guides the next phase of the transition. Will it be institutionalization within a rule of law context? Will it be a reproduction and consolidation of the attributes we've seen so far? Now, I'm just going to, wrap up with this and say, I don't think, obviously, that we should be naive or necessarily overly optimistic about what the prospects are for the kind of future that I think Syria's civil society would prefer to see as this process moves forward. But I also don't want to be overly pessimistic, and I don't want to completely dismiss entirely the possibility that something positive might come out of the work of the General Assembly. So we're at this important moment. I think the next few months are going to be really crucial, and I will leave it at that and look forward to hearing from the other speakers on the panel.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now I'll move to Basilius Zeno, who is an assistant professor of political studies at Trent University and an adjunct professor at York University. Basilius earned his PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His interdisciplinary work integrates research, advocacy, and policy engagement. Dr. Basilios Zeno is the author of The Empire's Mirror, The Coinage of Seleucid Kings of Syria. It's in Arabic, published by Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and he has published widely in academic journals and policy platforms. Basilius worked also on the sectarianization of the Syrian uprising and has received Best Paper Awards for Arab Political Science Association and Mesa Global Academy. So before giving him the floor, I recommend, especially because this is maybe an article that I think most experts on Syria, or all of them, had read, The Making of Sects, Boundary Making and the Sectarianization of the Syrian Uprising between 2011 and 2013, published in 2020. Also, the same article is translated into Arabic by Harmoun Center. We can find it on the internet. So this is a very good thing and very rare thing that an important article about the Syrian conflict is translated into Arabic. So I give the talk to Basilius, and then we'll have Shamiran. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Mustafa, for such a great introduction and timely topic. I'm also honored to see Stephen after, like, last time we met in person, and now we are dealing. We met before Asad, and also Shamir, like everyone. Salam, Lama. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be in such a great companionship, especially to think together about some of these key challenges that we are facing. My topic for today is to think about the challenges towards imagining post-Assad Syrian identity. I will engage with the three key questions, theoretical questions based on ongoing work that I have been conducting, specifically analyzing the rhetoric of unity, forgiveness, and the lack of institutionalized mechanism towards accountability, towards transitional justice. And as Stephen said, like if that was the path, we have ample of examples from history how to do that. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel and say, like, do we have a very special case beyond history? And these 6 months to 1 year are very crucial towards setting the foundation for the next stage. So it's arguably it's a regime in making. We still don't know what is the type, that we see more authoritarian features here and there, but it's yet early to judge and say this is a theocratic regime, it's a one-party regime, it's a Islamist regime. It's information. It's a regime information. So my engagement I will unpack 3 questions that I have been thinking about. The first one is, to what extent can post-conflict, quote unquote, because the seeds of conflict are still there, political institutions move beyond the symbolic repudiation of sectarian-based groupness, and what are the risks of reinscribing sectarian logics through the very architecture of transitional governance? The second question is, how do local civic efforts to rebuild the trust and foster inclusion interact with transitional institutions shaped by elite power consolidation? Can these bottom-up initiatives, and we have a lot of them, meaningfully influence the direction of post-Assad governance and reconciliation efforts? And the third question is, what role do media narratives play in shaping the legitimacy of post-authoritarian institutions in deeply divided society? But rather than assembling, let's start, like I will unpack each question here. But instead of assuming that we all are on the same page of what sectarianism is, it's rarely defined, actually. So by sectarianism, it's generally referred to the political mobilization of religious differences as a framework for the distribution of privileges, rights, and or violence among certain population. In my own work, I use sectarian identification rather than assuming identity as a fixed. So I don't use sectarian identity, but identification, by which I mean the appeal and the effect of identification to one sect or ethnicity or race or group or class, which in this case, in this case of Syria, means political identification around Alawitness, around Sunniness, around Shianess. It's a process in making, building on sociology of identity work, using groupness versus the groupist in particular. So we have a background here that we cannot jump over, which is that the Arab Spring represented a critical juncture, needless to say. But that critical juncture triggered deep political and institutional transformations at all level institutions, but also the self-perception of the self, identity, borders, alliances, and so on and so forth. And we see a collapse of that self-perception also towards the relation with Turkey, with the Kurds, with Israel, with Iran, etc. During these moments, we had, over the past 15 years, alliances between local and supra-local actors that have become pivotal during that period. Many have reshaped, reformed, and I watched the first session that you had last in the beginning, and it was great. It tells us the transformation of the HTS, for instance. So during that period, we had a struggle over symbolic power and representation that continue actually to lay on the ground, which influenced intra-group dynamics. So it's not just one group versus another group, pro-Assad versus the pro-opposition. Within that, we had intra-group dynamics. We started to see boundary-making strategies at the level of rhetoric, but also materialized in terms of violence. And also a competition over access to and control over state power. In post-2011, we have the militarization of the Syrian uprising started in the summer of 2011, which basically intensified the dynamic of internationalization of the uprising. We started to see more external actors become more involved, proxy war explicitly sometimes, but also implicitly. And we started to see more transitional networks expanded, including charities, individuals, especially in the Gulf. The resulting dynamics were new strategies of categorization and identification that had emerged, and these played out both online and also on the ground, reshaping how groups define themselves and others. So now let's unpack each theoretical question, starting with to what extent can post-conflict, quote-unquote, political institutions move beyond the symbolic reputation of sectarian-based groupness. So what we see based on the past 6 months is one is superficial gesture of inclusion, such as the releasing political prisoners and using unity rhetoric, forgiveness, create a symbolic break with the former regime, but do not necessarily alter institutional power structures, such as the lack of care in handling documents in the prisons or listening to the family of the disappeared persons in Syria, or protecting crime scenes such as mass graves or prisons despite the many pleas. I'm one of the people actually who tried with many institutions with no avail. HTS dominance over key ministries is still visible. On March 29th, as Mustafa said in the introduction, the formation of the 23-member cabinet to replace the caretaker government that had been in place since December 24 basically illustrated how power can remain centralized as HTS retains the most powerful seats. And we continue to see limited presence of women and minorities in transitional bodies, which suggests sometimes tokenisms and different audiences, Western audiences and local audiences, rather than structural inclusion. Another factor is the lack of any reference to democracy, as Stephen said, or mechanism for accountability, such as we don't have transparent elections yet, or independent oversight, institutional designs that risk replicating old patterns of exclusion and clientelism. Another factor is rewarding loyalty, auctioning of the state, ongoing, a rhetoric of really brutal new liberal policies. And the terrifying part for me observing is the de-Baathification process. During the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss that in replicating the dynamics that were in Iraq, which set the recipe for a disaster in the future. Another point is changing the content of school curriculum and avoiding secular national reference that happened on the first day of January 2025. This is not surprising as someone who analyzed the school curriculum in Syria over the past few years. That was the school curriculum in Idlib. So, and they aren't merely administrative reformation. They are deeply political acts that signal a redefinition of identity, citizenship, and legitimacy. The second rhetorical question, and the second question is how do local civic efforts to rebuild the trust and foster inclusion, interact with transitional institutions shaped by new elite power consolidation. In fact, the central government now is, or the de facto government is still weak. Therefore, we have many civil society organizations, many NGOs, many actually expats actually traveling back and forth. Group, for instance, like the civil peace groups and HOMS, actively work to reduce tensions and prevent sectarian escalation at the community level. These initiatives embody civic, non-sectarian visions of Syria's future. They offer, for instance, alternative to both state-driven and militant sectarian narratives. However, the work of this cross-sectarian and national organization is often undermined by structural challenges. The third point and final point is the question about the role of the media that played, and that was very evident in the mobilization, laying the foundation towards the massacre that was committed on March 8th and 9th and 10th. The role of the media in divided society. We saw that the HTS engaged in deliberate rebranding campaign that has multiple audiences, with the leader of a Sharia shifting from Islamist commander to Western-suited national unifier to craft a new political image. We have also symbolic moments such as the televised release of Sednaya prisoners were used to consolidate popular support and legitimacy and portray HTS as agents of justice and liberation. However, these performances were not matched by systemic reforms such as judicial accountability, participatory governance, or dismantling of carceral institutions. In fact, what we see is a gap between media discourse and lived realities, including continued violence and exclusion, kidnapping. The source of information is mostly many telegrams. And assuming like Syrians who are 93% or 90+% are under poverty line, the assumption that you have a smartphone to have access to social media to figure out which account is the real account on Telegram is something is mind-boggling. That undermines actually a trust in transnational projects. And also in that line, we have ambiguous foreign policy towards Turkey and Israel, which actually violated 1974 treaty and expanding and demolishing houses in Quneitra. In this vacuum, social media such as Telegrams became fragmented spaces, amplifying both official narratives and polarizing counter-discourses, often steeped in sectarian language. In conclusion, the Syrian transitional period offers a revealing case of how institutional design, media discourse, and sectarian memory intersect in shaping post-authoritarian futures. It's yet in making. I want to highlight that. This could change, this could be improved, this could be reversed. But despite the performative rhetoric of unity and symbolic rupture with the Assad regime, the transitional government as of today has largely failed thus far to establish inclusive, participatory, and accountable institutions. Arguably, we are witnessing instead a consolidation of elite power, particularly by the HTS, under the guise of national renewal, and transitional justice mechanism remain vague. Economic alternatives are absent, and civil society voices, especially those working toward non-sectarian futures, are peripheral to the decision-making processes. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basil. And I want to thank again the interpreters. I remember that I listened to Basil and he talked about debathification. I don't know if Shamiran will take about the same topic, but she will give us an insight into the Iraqi comparative perspective on the Iraqi experience. So I will present Shamiran. Shamiran Mako is an assistant professor of international relations and political science at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Her research focuses on the international relations and comparative politics of the Middle East, with a substantive emphasis on ethnic politics, institutions and power sharing, post-conflict state building, and governance in divided societies. She is the author of Structuring Exclusion, Institutions, Grievances, and Ethnic State Capture in Iraq with Oxford University Press 2025, and the book Before After the Arab Uprisings, Progress and Stagnation in the Middle East and North Africa, co-authored with Valentin Mugaddam, published by Cambridge University Press 2021. The floor is yours, Shamiran.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thank you to Basilios and Stephen. And I really want to thank the API and the APSN. I'm really delighted to be here with you. And I'm delighted to be part of this super timely conversation. I think as Mustafa mentioned and Basilios touched on and Stephen in other ways, coming in from that Iraq experience and my knowledge of Iraq, I want to highlight 4 kind of broad institutional and structural factors that I think shape wartime transitions more so than anything else. And I want to emphasize that in many ways, what Iraq has taught us in other cases, including Bosnia and Herzegovina and others, is that really the hardest part of state building is thinking about the day after, thinking about what happens next. Revolutions come and go, regime changes come and go. But the hardest part is really thinking about whether or not a transition is going to be a securitized transition, where armed forces in all sorts of kind of in all sorts of ways come to dominate the transition and are embedded actually structurally in the state. And the other part is whether or not a transition is inclusionary or exclusionary. And so that in many ways actually determines the nature of both the type of political settlement that emerges and the elite buy-in into that political settlement from key stakeholders, ethnic groups, civic organizations, which are really, really instrumental. And I think undermining them, if anything, the Iraq transition has taught us that undermining those civic organizations will have this kind of blowback effect in the future in terms of creating an ethno-sectarian political order. And so to begin with, I want to highlight the question of the role of the military in the state. I think in so many ways, Iraq and Syria are compared in that you both have, in both cases, you have the Ba'ath Party, and the Ba'ath Party was so well entrenched in the bureaucratic and institutional structures of the state that it's hard to think about what happens with the military. And one of the kind of bigger questions that the Iraq transition taught us was that will coercive institutions at the national and at the local level, will they be dissolved? And will there be a process of conversion and layering? This is what we call in the kind of institutional literature, where you may not necessarily get rid of all the institutions. So you're not starting from a clean slate, but rather there needs to be a kind of pretty considerate forethought about what's going to happen with the coercive institutions of the state, both at the local level and at the national level. So here we're thinking about the mukhabarat, the secret service, which sustained the regime in many ways, the role of local police, the role of, if there's a federal police force, and the role of the military. And the reason why I bring that up is because in my work on de-Baathification, one of the things, the kind of lessons learned in the case of Iraq, is that dismantling entire state institutions at the national level and at the local level really spells disaster. De-Baathification in Iraq was first top-down. It was exclusionary, and it was used as a transitional justice mechanism in the name of lustration that essentially became heavily politicized as a way of actually weeding out and targeting specific members of the former regime, predominantly Sunni Arabs. And so the question for Syria, I think, in looking towards Iraq is, what will de-Baathification look like? Is there going to be a process of de-Baathification? All of this is kind of couched within larger questions of what we call in the transitional justice literature lustration. And we think about much of that was actually modeled on post-war Germany with denazification. And we've seen these types of institutions, for example, also kind of be implemented at different levels in the former communist transitions of Eastern Europe, and so forth. But in all of it, one of the key takeaways from any type of de-Baathification mechanism that the Iraq War taught us is that it needs to be consultative, right? It needs to be inclusive. The lustration process has to include elements of the former government or members of the former regime and this speaks to the kind of more complexities of the lustration process is, rather than having this kind of blanket attitude of kind of getting rid of all of the command structures of the former regime, is actually creating, and this is the most difficult part, is creating toolkits to be able to vet out and weed out levels of complicity with crimes. This is something that wasn't done for Iraq. in the more successful transitions and lustration as a transitional justice tool, this was kind of taken into account. And so, but that makes that kind of question a lot harder. But again, it really kind of shapes the success or failure of any type of de-Baathification. The second kind of, I think, big factor on an institutional and structural level is the nature of the constitutional drafting process. I think the constitutional drafting process, what the Iraq War and the Iraq transition has taught us, tends to be the stickiest. And it's the stickiest in terms of how institutions go, is because in many ways it actually determines in the long horizon how negotiations amongst a political elite will play out. It also tells us whether or not the constitutional drafting process itself is consultative. Is it top-down? Is it horizontal? Is it inclusive? The question of minorities and minority integration in the case of Syria, I think there's some parallels with Iraq, but I think Iraq in the way is a bit more complex in terms of that minority question. But in the case of Syria, if anything Iraq has taught us, the question of minorities actually in some ways is like the canary in a coal mine. It tells us about whether or not that political transition is inclusive, is representative, and it will tell us whether or not there are actually pathways for dealing with really difficult questions in the future. So that kind of long-term horizon versus short-term outcomes really matters in thinking about what that constitutional drafting process is going to look like, because it is going to determine stability, but also how conflict is mediated in the future over core issues, whether that be federalism, fiscal federalism, the nature of the electoral system, the nature of the presidential system or prime minister system, etc. In the case of Iraq, the transition is different because the transition was foreign imposed, whereas the case in the Syria transition, it was domestically through kind of revolutionary means. But the Iraqi Governing Council adopted this kind of transitional constitution called the TAL. And with that, there was initially really, really cohesive efforts to actually integrate and have proportional representation. And in both cases, both the Natal and the Iraqi Governing Council, we saw proportional representation of various actors and various kind of ethno-sectarian communities. And I think what that did was that it actually did generate cohesive buy-in into that constitutional making process. Now, whether or not that the Constitution is perfect and whether or not the Constitution dealt with difficult questions, I think is the more salient point that in many ways Iraq's political actors are dealing with now, especially when it comes to the distribution of oil, the role and relationship between the regions, for example, the Kurdistan Regional Government, which is a federally recognized entity. And I'm happy to go into these in the Q&A in a lot more detail. The third is, again, going back to this question of lustration as a transitional justice mechanism. And I want to highlight that if there's one thing that the Iraq case has taught us, is that there's a symbolic kind of emphasis on transitional justice versus more kind of comprehensive integration of lustration and transitional justice mechanisms in a more inclusionary way. If it's top-down and exclusionary, and if there are blanket policies that are made towards, certain sectors and members of the former regime, the de-Baathification process in Iraq has taught us that that just doesn't bode well in the future. And again, where cases have been successful in the question of lustration is actually thinking through the different layers and thinking through how those different layers of complicity with the former regime are going to be thought about in terms of, generating stability. But outright exclusion, targeted purges at the bureaucratic level and the military level, sham trials that kind of generate complicity, really, I think, is one of the key ways in which the de-Baathification process in Iraq failed as a transitional justice tool. And so there's a lot of kind of forethought for Syria in what to do with that during this really critical phase of the transition. And the fourth thing I want to highlight is the question of power sharing. Much of in the institutional design literature, one of the things we focus on, especially in deeply divided societies like Iraq, like Syria, like Lebanon, is will power sharing in the various ways in which, if it is actually going to be considered in the case of Syria, Iraq is a bit different. The political elite that were part of the exiled groups in Iraq came in with the idea that the Iraqi state is going to be decentralized, that federalism is going to be the guiding principle in the constitutional and power sharing process, and that power sharing and consociationalism were already kind of selected as the institutional frameworks for the transition. I think in the case of Syria, that's a little bit different. We don't see this kind of effort at actually thinking through what the nature of the state is going to be. And I think that's going to be really important because if anything, other comparative cases, including regional ones, have taught us that maybe some kind of lessons learned, examples of lessons learned for Syria, is that thinking through these mechanisms ultimately generate consensus and cooperation. And these dual processes in many ways actually interact and shape both ethnic and non-ethnic kind of interactions within the political elite and the political class. And the reason why I highlight that is because in many ways that will determine the scope of durability of the post-Assad institutions that will be chosen to govern Syria. And in the case of, these kind of transitions from authoritarian rule, especially in the case of Syria, given that the transition was actually domestically induced, that's going to have really kind of salient questions about whether or not we're going to see this reinstitutionalization of a neo-patrimonial state in Syria, though with a different political class, or whether or not you're going to have a much more kind of inclusive state, albeit it may not necessarily be fully democratic in the ways we, think about Belgium or Holland or the UK. But that kind of local level variation, again, is going to tell us whether or not there's going to be a neo-patrimonial state that's hierarchical, that's exclusionary, that's going to reinforce both in the short term and the long term kind of ethnic cleavage structures, or whether or not there's going to be some sort of a political solution that elites within Syria are going to devise that's going to shape that kind of transition and post-conflict state building process. And I think Iraq, just to kind of conclude, there's many lessons that are to be, taken from the Iraq transition. I do want to kind of offer a cautionary tale about overgeneralizing the Iraq state building process with the Syrian state building process. But I do think there's a couple of kind of salient issues to consider. One is the question of transitional justice. And de-Baathification, whether or not that's going to be implemented in the case of Syria, that's kind of, out in the open. And the other one is the actual nature of the institutions of the state itself. Is it going to be that the current administration is going to essentially layer over the existing authoritarian institutions of the state at the bureaucratic level, at the coercive level, or is there going to be kind of cohesive and really deeply thought out ways in which to reform the Syrian state at every level? And I think this is where we're going to have kind of, a question of both short-term success and long-term success measures, right? And whether or not the transition itself becomes successful. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to kind of speak into if there are any questions within the Q&A about the kind of more detailed aspects, whether or not a proportional representation system versus a SNTV system. These are the kind of more technocratic elements of building an electoral system in the case of both Syria and Iraq. And so I'll leave it at that. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shamiran. And now we'll move to Salam Al-Saadi. Salam Al-Saadi is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and an incoming postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. His research focuses on authoritarianism and contentious politics in divided societies. His current book project examines the survival and governance strategies of minority-dominated regimes. Prior to his PhD studies, Salam worked as a journalist in Syria and Lebanon, writing for Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, Al-Mudun, and Al-Arab newspaper. The floor is yours, Salam.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for the introduction and for the invitation. Thank you, Lema and Sarah, for the organization. I'm really happy to be here with everyone on this panel. So in my brief talk, I want to highlight quickly three main points. The first is on the Syrian government reliance on informal rather than formal rules so far. And second, what Syria shares with other post-conflict cases. And third, whether there is still room for a kind of a minimal form of inclusion, democracy and inclusion. So in the first month after the collapse of Assad regime, there was widespread hope and even expectations among many Syrians, as Stephen mentioned, that Syria was entering a moment of serious deliberation around institutional and constitutional design. For many, it looked like a replay of Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, like elected or inclusive bodies, negotiations, and new constitutions. Or if not like Tunisia and Egypt, then at least something like Iraq after 2003 with power sharing agreement and arrangement. But today, and based on the actions of the new government, we know that this is not really the case, I think. Not everything is on the table today. So first, I think we should ask, of course, does the new authority in Syria actually want to engage in power sharing? In the immediate aftermath of Assad's fall, the answer was not clear. Al-Shara rhetoric was surprisingly inclusive, shockingly so for many Syrians at the time. But now I think it's clear. There is very clear hesitation, especially when it comes to formal power sharing arrangements that would bind the leadership to enforceable rules and institutions. And this reluctance is very clear, of course, when dealing with actors beyond their immediate support base. Groups like the SDF, the Kurdish-led SDF, Syria Democratic Forces, and other minorities that can't be easily co-opted. But even with other actors, inclusion remains limited, right? Very limited indeed. Just look at the Constitutional Declaration or the People's Assembly, the Parliament. The constitutional design outlined in the March Constitutional Declaration has not been fully implemented, and there is no timeline for implementation. And same with the People Assembly, the Parliament remained vacant and only moved forward this week recently and in a very tightly controlled manner. Al-Shara also still has not appointed a vice president. So what this shows is that he's focused less on building stable institutions and more on managing the balance of power within his own coalition. Patronage and loyalty seem to matter more than long-term institutional design at the moment. And it's likely he does intend to formalize some rules eventually, and he's doing so very slowly. But right now, I think, in my opinion, he feels too fragile to commit or be able to enforce anything. So he delays and maintain a kind of state of ambiguity around this. In the meantime, governance rests on a network of loyalty and patronage. There is no coherent institutional blueprint, just domination of ad hoc informal rules. The first circle around Al-Shara is built purely on loyalty. We don't know a lot about this circle, right? But we know certain figures. Partly we don't know because of this domination of informal rules mentality, the logic of informal rules. But we know certain figures, the foreign minister, for example, interior minister, defense minister, and other, including Al-Shara brothers, right? And there is a second layer, figures from groups like Ahrar Sham and other allied factions. We don't also know enough about the relationship after the transition between these different, these two layers. So in the absence of clear and transparent plan for institutional building and design, informal rules are being entrenched right now in Syria. And that's dangerous, not only because it excludes many, right? It's exclusionary, but because also we can't know where it's headed, right? Informality might work in the short term, but it leaves the future very uncertain. So instead of a clear design, you get a system shaped by uncertainty and improvisation, I think. And this is what we're getting now, which is the opposite of what institutions are supposed to offer or do, right? A high level of uncertainty. So this is my first point. But again, let me here stress that this is not unique to Syria, of course, or HTS or Al-Shara. There is broader evidence that rebel victories tend to produce more concentrated power. In general, civil wars or revolutions that end with a rebel victory are less likely to result in power-sharing institutions. This tendency is even stronger when there is a clear dominant rebel faction or group or near monopoly, as is the case in Syria today. In those cases, we often see the establishment of authoritarian institutions. Like some of the strongest authoritarian ruling parties in Africa, for example, are victorious rebels, like in Uganda and Rwanda. After winning civil wars, these rebel parties consolidated control and power. And even when they hold elections, they tend to win. And not only because of repression, but also due to their control of violence, monopoly of violence, and legitimacy that they gain after war. And this is also something that the new Syrian government has right now. I can say more about this if later, if it is of interest. We also know that longer civil wars involving rebel governance, as has happened with Syria, long civil war with the experience of liberal governance in Idlib, tend to build the institutional know-how. That is the skills that are necessary and later applied to managing the new state institution and staffing its bureaucracy. And this experience can reduce the need to include other actors, of course, right, in post-war governance. And HTS governed Idlib before taking Damascus, and so far they have drawn on that experience extensively after taking power. It has allowed them also to purge much of the old elites in the state institution. Of course, they still face the real constraint in terms of experience and capacity, especially in some sectors. So they have brought in some outsiders, some actors from outside, but without full partnership so far, and with total ambiguity about their role and their relationship. But that said, there's still a slim but real chance of power sharing that comes from, in my opinion, from the fact that major regions and parties remain outside Al-Sharia control, the SDF and Suwaida, and probably some other factions. These actors are pushing for decentralization or some form of decentralization and power sharing, right? And I think that pressure matters a lot. This might be crucial if Syria is to move towards a minimalist form of democracy, because as I mentioned earlier, democracy after civil war, especially after rebel victory, is really difficult. It's very rare. But a formal power sharing agreement can go a long way towards building at least basic level of political competition, reducing control and repression, and softening the edges of authoritarianism, if we can say. So this is basically what I'm calling minimal democracy, or in the literature also called electoral authoritarianism. And most civil war settlements that failed to include power sharing provisions, clear power sharing provisions, did not transition to a democracy or minimalist democracy. But by contrast, in places like Iraq and Nepal, Liberia, where power sharing was explicitly included and built into the settlement process, some form of minimalist democracy did emerge. Again, by minimalist democracy, I mean a system that has basic political competition, at least partially free elections, but clearly falling short of a full liberal democracy. So Syria still has a window, but this will require actual negotiations with the actors that are still not part of the government right now, and could lead to a formal power sharing arrangement and a real institutional process. Of course, this leads to a discussion about centralization and decentralization that I will not go into right now to leave time for discussion, but this is also something important, because this centralization, decentralization is a double-edged sword, as we say, right? It has different positive things to offer, but also negative aspects related to entrenching sectarian identity sometimes, and even dysfunctioning states, as the experiences around us in different regions, including Arab countries. We can talk about that in the Q&A more. I will leave it there. Thank you, and back to you, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Salam, and thank you everyone for your excellent talks. Before transmitting the question of our audience, I want to get back to some topics raised by all of you. Why not putting together the topic of institutional transition and sectarianism, given that all of you talked about power sharing. My question to anyone who wants to respond is, would it be better, or is it much more complicated than this, that the power sharing in the constitution between communities and between religious identities would be explicitly present in the constitution, or we might have examples where there is more ambiguity about this point, and it would protect individuals from those minorities from the process of identification or the othering from other communities, etc. So I will stop here because I have other extensions of the question. If anybody wants to, Stephen, if you have anything to say.
Well, I mean, I always have something to say, which doesn't mean that it's going to be worthwhile, but I think you raise a really very important point, because there are many different forms of power sharing, as Salam mentioned, and many of them come with downsides. And this is, you know, the issue of whether a formally centralized system of government might nonetheless leave space for decision-making, resource allocation, local level governance, even if those are not enacted into the Constitution or written into the Constitution, is something that to me seems a very lively possibility, and one that I would hope might temper some of the concerns about the likelihood that a constitution will in fact embody claims about the sort of maximalist sovereignty of the state in national governance. Because even under the Assad regime, as we saw, sovereignty was layered in the domestic context. There were local actors who played meaningful roles under the umbrella of this security state that could at any time insert itself into local governance. But there was some space for communities to manage local affairs, to resolve local disputes, to handle circumstances in which, you know, to appeal to the federal government would have been seen as risky or counterproductive. So this notion of layered sovereignty, even in a system of centralized authority, is one that I think is worth exploring, frankly. And I'll leave it at that because I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Maybe Shamiram, from the Iraqi constitutional experience and constitutional drafting, you have been talking about it. Was it that explicit as in Lebanon, for example? What can we learn from? Yeah, thank you, please.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It wasn't explicit. The Iraqi constitution, unlike Lebanon and unlike in some other places, it actually doesn't, codify that you have to have, the prime minister has to be Shia, that the president has to be a Kurd, and that the speaker of parliament has to be a Sunni. But informally it is. I think for me, the question and thinking about the broader literature and actually comparative cases, it's less about whether or not it's formally or informally codified, and it's more about the actual application. Because you can have systems where it's not formally codified, but it functions. And much of that speaks to what I had said earlier, is will the new regime create a system where there is elite buy-in, where there's cooperation and consensus over policymaking? I think in terms of the constitutional process in Iraq, it was consultative. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but in that kind of initial phase between 2004 and 2005, when the constitutional referendum took place, the Iraqi constitution is, as it stands, isn't necessarily all that bad. But what we've seen happening afterwards that I think has led so much of that kind of political stagnation in Iraq's transition. And I do want to caveat it by saying, look, Iraq has had electoral cycles and elections that have been considered free and fair, but the electoral playing field in itself, because of patronage, is stacked in a way that favors, the dominant coalitions. But that is much more of a question about the electoral law and the nature of the electoral system. Is it, single transferable vote versus single non-transferable vote, the proportional mechanism, and less to do with the Constitution itself. That kind of feeds into that institutional mechanism that sustains patronage. And so for me, I think in thinking about the kind of more broad comparative cases, you have some cases where it's, clearly codified and it fails to deliver, right? Case of Lebanon, for example, as you mentioned. In the case of Iraq, it's not formally codified, but it does shape the informal interactions amongst the political elite. Now, that's bad because it does generate this kind of very stagnating kind of, potential, thwarted democratic process. But it has in some ways actually generated stability. At the end of the day, the Kurds and the Arabs and the different kind of communities outside of foreign intervention during the civil war era between 2008 to 2010, and then with ISIS's onslaught, you haven't seen this kind of political violence where community A targets community B. And so, the system itself is deeply flawed, but it's been kind of tacitly successful in other arenas in terms of how we, depending on how we measure success. So that's all to say is I think really it's less to do about whether or not it's codified, and so much of it is actually going to depend on the electoral law. And so I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. So now maybe Salam or Basilius, but I want to extend the question. So let's go on the same topic, but on the ground. Between military factions or armed groups. The government of Damascus wants to merge Syrian democratic forces within the new institution of the Ministry of the Interior and the army. So let's just imagine what kind of trust, if like Kurdish soldiers of Kurdish obedience or of Syrian Democratic Forces obedience would be within his former enemies and vice versa. How is it practical, and to what extent the Damascus government is serious about merging this way? Does it mean that they don't want? Because also, let's get back to Iraq. When Saddam Hussein fell, the northern Iraq, the Kurdistan of Iraq, was already autonomous, and they were their security forces were the Peshmerga, and we understand that till now there are tensions between these parts of the Iraq, and it never recovered. So is it practical on the ground to imagine this scenario, or is it only to push for another period the question of reuniting Syria or getting back the whole territory, or is it much more complicated than yes or no? I don't know if Salam wants to say something, or Basilius.
I can start very quickly. I think it does not depend on trust. Clearly, there is no trust, right, on both sides. I think one thing is that the new Syrian government is relying on, they're trying to avoid formal, as I said, formal power sharing agreement and arrangements. That's clear, right? They're engaging to some degree, but we don't really know the extent to which they are very serious about it, or it's related to external pressure or not. They have certain experience of making certain power sharing arrangements, which is good, but we don't still know. There are many signs that they're not very serious about that. And also, generally speaking, victorious rebels can be especially effective at eliminating rival centers of power or multiple sovereignties and imposing some form of stability because of their certain attributes that they have: cohesive leadership, internal discipline, command, and experience in managing territories before, right? And HTS was partly, not fully, successful in doing that. The number one fear among Syrians after Assad's fall was the civil war would continue, and this time between factions that had fought Assad, right? But Al-Sharia government acted quickly. They brought the factions into Damascus and consolidated control, creating two coercive institutions, the army and the security forces, that appeared relatively stable and were able to credibly, I think, promise stability, at least offer the promise, right? And this increased their legitimacy substantially, I would say, among huge parts of Syria. Not everyone, of course. In certain communities, it decreased, right? But I think they're building on that, leveraging this popularity and legitimacy that they built. And it's really not that hard, honestly, because the bar to build this kind of legitimacy after civil war is really low, right? People are really exhausted from war. So any partner any faction that can offer this kind of minimal stability, a resemblance of order and stability, they will win popularity very quickly. And there are survey evidence around that factions that are able to offer some kind of stability, people would just overlook their authoritarian past and violence and everything, right? I think they are building on that and leveraging that in their relationship and negotiations with the SDF. So it's really hard to think that they're gonna go into this kind of power sharing agreements, but at the same time, they have really opaque logic of decision making and everything so far. So we can't tell. I mean, there is still a possibility that they would go that course.
Thank you so much. So now we are going to see the Q&R section. So I'm going to select the questions that are the closer to today's topic. For example, there's a question about civil society. It will be our next session about civil society. There's another about Lebanon. We invoked Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, etc. I will take the question of Nadim Houri, given Salam's comment that rebel victories tend to lead to authoritarian governance structures. Can we form a kind of local resistance with local governance and decentralization spaces? Can, in other words, can the principle of decentralization create or provide the population with a tool of resistance toward the new authoritarian regime? And I want to add why, and also on concrete and to integrate the point of sectarianism, in Syria also, those spaces, let's take Sueda, for example, let's take Syrian Democratic Forces in northeastern Syria. Those spaces, the problem in Syria, maybe they are identified ethnically and not economically, for example, or anything else. Basilios, do you have anything to say about this, about this duality of the kind of homogeneous identity of the space and its demand for decentralization, for example? How to find a balance between this possibility or decentralization? If you have anything to say, of course.
Sure. So this is a challenging question, of course, because it's about identifying or diagnosing structural and institutional problems, at the same time recognizing the legacies of 54 plus years of authoritarian ruling. And we, like, when you have all of that collapse all of the sudden, you don't wake up the day after and have embracing like a new identity. What we have is actually a de facto, like the question about centralized. I think there's a problem in approaching this top-down approach to reunifying Syria and as a centralized government. We have a de facto decentralized territories. Like, take for example, Idlib, which is the model that has been praised by the Salvation government, etc., has been integrated into even the economy, Turkish economy, the sphere of influence of Turkey. The Kurds have been integrated into the American interest, right? Like, and we have this battle back in the 2017 when Trump decided to withdraw the troop all of a sudden, and we have these mechanisms back and forth. We cannot jump over them. In Sweden, there were ongoing protests for over a year and a half in Sahat al-Karami before the collapse of the regime, demanding the collapse of the regime. They removed even the statue of Hafiz al-Assad before the actual collapse of the regime. So they trusted their own local militia, and that was a kind of compromise that they had. I grew up in Sweden, so I consider it, it's dear to my heart. So in Sweden, these local mechanism also, the Assad regime had reached a compromise, but we saw in the past, like back in 2016, 17, when they would allow, for instance, infiltration from ISIS members to attack from al-Badi side and have actually suicide attack in the middle of Sweden as a method. So what does that mean? There is a turning point that I cannot emphasize enough, and you brought it in your opening remarks, Mustafa, and we cannot underestimate the impact of the March 25 massacres in the Syrian coast. We cannot undermine the rhetoric that even Shaybani, the official narrative, during the meeting in Brussels, actually, he in March 17, so a few days, less than a week than the massacres, he actually labeled the Assad family era as 45 years, I'm quoting here, of minority rule, which I'm quoting again, led to the displacement of more than 15 million Syrians, the death of 1 million, and the oppression of the majority and other minorities. This is very dangerous rhetoric. This is very dangerous rhetoric. And we saw that before actually we have solid evidence and testimonies that there were crimes committed against local civilians, that there was a complete denial. And then the narrative shifted towards that it's the Fulul, the remnant of the regime, killed Alawite for refusing actually to cooperate with them. And then with the number actually started to be revealed and documented, like at least like, and I remember like in March 10, we have at least, I'm looking at my record, like 1,743 civilians documented between March 6 and March 10. Destruction in 62 villages and towns and neighborhoods. And we have many disappeared persons as of today. So the numbers are conservative numbers. So we have people who disappeared. Women have been kidnapped. We don't know their whereabouts. Sometimes they said they were married off to someone else, and sometimes we have gangs or criminals. So why I'm bringing this? Because there was a mobilization. I remember that day when they were called for jihad in the. I thought like my wife's family are from Banyas when the massacres took place, and actually had that chance. Like I spent 2 full weeks interviewing survivors and documenting their testimonies and linking them to actually international organizations. So I had like firsthand testimonies, not just the news, and about the mechanism. It's we know who was in most cases who was implicated in these massacres, and some of them are troops basically that were declared as part of the Syrian Ministry of Defense. So not just militia, like Abu Amshi, for instance, is one of them. We know for a fact that his troops basically were involved in many massacres in Jabli, Lataki, etc. We know the perpetrators in many cases. They filmed themselves. So even when we have 3-4 cases that they were arrested because they shot an elderly one, we don't know, like the whole judicial system is on hold. So since we don't have a clear, transparent mechanism of transitional justice based on what, like you are attacking, like when you are arresting senior officers, what happened? Like where are the testimonies? Where are the like? It's not transparent. Which law you are applying? Is it Sharia law? Is it human rights law? Is it international law? Like it's not clear. When they arrest someone, it's not clear. So why this is very significant because after that you refer to that leaked audio about the Druze community. So we have over 100 people, civilians, Druze, were killed. So how come these local community would trust a government when just a week ago they saw a massacre when they cannot have when they give up their weapons? Because what the many Alawites argue that we gave up our weapons. There was, of course, an ambush. There is no deny about that. But to penalize the collective punishment of the rest of Alawite is and that's not surprising. The surprising is that this didn't happen when the regime collapsed. So we had a moment of hope, actually, because that retaliation didn't take place when the Assad regime collapsed, but it took a while. But there was a building up. When you have like soldiers actually going to Alawite and Ismaili and Druze towns and say like, what's the name of this town? And you say like, oh, it's a Salamiyya. Then they ask you to howl like a dog or crawl. And then they said tuz or like whatever, like curse word, like cursing your religion. That built up. So we saw that public humiliation on and on and on. Did we see any clear, like there was an investigation, right? Like declared by a Sharia. Where are the results? They announced like in 1 month. Great. Let me give me hope in trusting you, right? Give me, you have the mechanism, give me hope. And they disappear. And then another stage, like now let's deal with sanctions. Now let's deal with Iran. You cannot separate and say it like Assad used to do. Let's prioritize like national security sovereignty and let's smash the rest of the population for the sake and sacrifice them. So yeah.
Thank you, Basil.
We'll
Thank you so much. So we still have the time for one question. It's maybe we'll take a question about the economy and the first question, Aksenenok Alexander. It's about post-Assad regime that is facing conditional external support. And we know that we have support or pressure from the UAE, from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, the policy of Israel, of invading, of occupying. Stephen, to what extent can we expect a kind of shape of form of the economy that will also strongly depend on external pressure?
Yeah, thanks, Mustafa. I'll try and be brief and send greetings to Alexander as well. I think there are three different vectors at play here. On one hand, we have clear indications that the Ashara government is rebuilding and reinforcing the kind of crony networks that existed during the phase of the Assad regime. And we see this in the reconciliation efforts directed at some key regime figures, some with very unsavory backgrounds, who have now been permitted to renew economic operations, and this may be an expression of the depth and severity of the crisis the country faces, but still, it's not a very reassuring trend, and that goes hand in hand with the empowerment of very shady business figures, HTS business cronies, and the emergence of Idlib as an increasingly important economic center. So that's one. The second, I think, is the very active encouragement, as I see it, by the Gulf states for an economy which is more capable legally and institutionally of receiving foreign direct investment and using foreign business agreements, including the one signed recently around electricity, the development of the electricity sector involving Turkey, Qatar, and I think a US-based Qatari firm that will, if it moves forward, have important benefits for the Syrian population, but which is not going to be something that we see the gains from overnight. And then third, there is the sanctions dimension, the sanctions vector. And there, it does seem to me that there is an effort, and U.S. sanctions are clearly, I hate to say it, but are clearly the most significant in this regard. And the General License 25 is in place. It vastly expands the scope of economic activity that is now exempt from sanctions. But in addition, just in the last week or 10 days, a member of the House of Representatives and within the Senate have introduced legislation to lift the sanctions imposed under the Syria Civilian Protection Act. Those are very important moves. My big concern was that Congress would not act within the window available to repeal Caesar, and it seems that an effort is being made to do that. So I see all three of these vectors at work. I think Basilios mentioned the consolidation of a neoliberal economy. But my sense is that we are likely to continue to see a significant share of economic activity held by the public sector. Nonetheless, it's these three vectors that I think tell us a lot about where the emphasis on economic recovery is headed for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Stephen. Thanks to everyone, to all of you for this really terrific discussion. I thank the public, the audience for all their questions, and we are sorry that we couldn't answer all of them. Thank you, Lama, for the efforts you made on the Q&R session. I have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I want to thank, before all, the interpreters for the effort. I guess it was huge. And I want to remind the public that if you want to continue with the other sessions or for any other information, please go to the website Arab Reform Initiative and Arab Political Science Network and register to the newsletter to receive information about the Arab world politics and also about the future sessions. I think that the future session will be on the 17th of July, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the 17th of July. It will be either on transitional justice or on civil society. Anyway, we'll have more information about it. I thank you so much for your presence and political economy. I'm sorry, and see you soon. And have a nice weekend. No, it's it's not the weekend yet. So see you soon and have a nice day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Sarah and Lama as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.